how good is weird tea?
My weird tea is actually gone. Do you know why, Kevin? Because it's so good.
Because our PAs have not brought us a new weird tea.
I know. What's up with that, you guys? Bring us some tea.
We need weird tea. It's an amazing company, some friends of mine that started a long time ago. They're all about donating to charity. So if you buy online and you put the code Kevin, they'll donate to the Unite the United Foundation.
Don't put Tony in the box, put Kevin, because they won't do shit if you put Tony in the box.
Put Tony in the box, but don't tape it closed. Drink weird. So, hey, Tony.
What's happening, Kevin?
Well, this episode's going to be a little intense because...
I'm afraid of this episode.
I don't think you should be afraid.
Okay.
It's a little more serious episode because we're going to be talking to our friend Christian Picciolini. I was turned on to him by, I think, Kate and Sarah were like, hey, can you meet this guy, Christian? And I'm like, sure. So we sat down. He had a record label called Sinister Records. I'm like, of course, let's sit down and talk about your bands and everything. But I found out so much about his past history that I didn't know back then. And then we're going to talk about like interns because I believe in like giving so many people a chance, but sometimes you're going to get one bad apple.
I'm scared of this episode, Kevin.
Why? Why are you scared, Tony?
Because I'm Mexican.
Because I'm Mexican. Thanks for saying that.
This one is pretty intense because who was Christian?
When I first met you, Kevin, it wasn't something that I was flaunting. I was still trying to work through the fact that I had just left the American white supremacist movement. In 1987, when I was 14 years old, up until 1995, really, I was an American neo-Nazi skinhead. I was recruited when I was 14 years old, and I spent 8 years as a part of that. By 1996, which is actually the first year that I went to Warped Tour, and I should say that you were a big part of my life. Warped Tour was one of those things that helped to change my opinion of the world. It helped to introduce me to people that I normally wouldn't have associated with because of my views, and it was something that really helped to change me. So I want to thank you for that. But yeah, before I met you, I was involved in the American neo-Nazi skinhead movement. I was a member of 2 bands during that time, 2 racist bands. I have since, in the last 20 plus years, been working against that movement that I helped build back in the 80s. I co-founded an organization called Life After Hate, and then later an organization called the Free Radicals Project, which essentially was there to help people disengage from extremist movements, to be the bridge out and to help them start to understand what they needed to do to repair the harm that they had caused, because it had been something that I had been doing for many, many years. Yeah, when we first started talking, I was kind of living my second life after that. I was back into music, but into the punk rock world. I was managing bands like Flatfoot 56. I managed the Briggs, Street Dogs for a hot minute, bands like The Frantic, all bands that played, your Warped Tour. So it was a really influential time for me to be exposed to people from all different walks of life.
I didn't know when I met him about his...
You had no idea.
I had no idea about his history, but it was also something we tackled a lot on tour.
I imagine, because let's be honest about the punk rock culture. A lot of that punk rock came from a racist culture in some places, other ways it didn't.
In Southern California, we had like this whole scene of music that was like punk rock, but it was very violent. There was like this undertone of violence, and this undertone of like white supremacy violence was part of that. And to be honest, for me, I really thought so many of these bands were speaking in a higher way, to be honest. Bad Religion, that they were speaking that we needed to hear them and not be fearful of them. So when I did the Warped Tour, one of the things, by taking it into the daylight, the Warped Tour was a daytime show, because I felt that 90% of the problems are caused by 10% of the people under cover of darkness. So I was like, how do I bring this music that is very important to a way so people aren't fearful of being beaten at it? And seriously, in the LA punk culture, you could get beaten for just looking different. And through the years, we tackled this because we would travel the country, and people didn't realize that we would go to places like Salt Lake City, which was a very hotbed of the straight edge punk culture, but in a weird supremacy way that if you drank or you smoked or if you did anything, you were a bad person and you deserved to be beaten.
What?
Oh, yeah. The straight edge punk culture used this guise of being like clean for violence. And we would go to different cities and have to tackle this.
I'll be honest with you. In the 80s and 90s, I loved the music, but I didn't become a big part of it because of the fear of racism, not being white, honestly. And another thing I have to say about this is there's nothing worse than a racist hates other than a reformed racist. So is his life in danger?
We'll talk about this a little bit more, but absolutely, because right now we're dealing with it like this extremism on the internet. Like people are living like birds are drones, and they're fucking talking about all this crazy shit. But Christian was someone who actively went out and tried to like change people's lives. Christian actually took a stand. He could have left the movement, decided that this isn't for him, but he actively jumped in and said, let's do something about it.
Deprogramming is probably not the right word. I call it disengagement, because the further you bring somebody out from that type of movement, whether it's QAnon or white supremacy or neo-Nazism, the more that they get exposed to things on the outside. It's not always easy, right? QAnon is a tough one because they are so dead set in their ideas of what's happening in the world, which have no basis in reality whatsoever. But what I say is, and I've worked with hundreds, maybe even 1,000 people at this point, people don't find their way to those movements because they're looking for it necessarily. Those movements are looking for them. So they get scooped up by conspiracy theories and fake news and these ideas that just aren't true. And it's because they're looking for a sense of identity, community, and purpose. That's something that we all look for. Every single person on earth is looking for the sense of who am I, where do I belong, and what am I supposed to do with my life. But a lot of people hit also what I call potholes in their life and in their search for those three things. And potholes are traumas. Potholes can be abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, mental abuse. It can also be challenges with mental health. It can be job loss sometimes. It can be a million different things that happen to all of us. But when those things accumulate and people can't find the answers for those and they start to feel pain, sometimes people will then project that pain onto others. And I've always said that it's less about hatred for somebody else than it is for hatred for yourself being projected onto somebody else. They can't figure out their lives, so they're looking for somebody to blame for those voids in their lives. And historically, they've blamed people of color, they've blamed brown people, they've blamed LGBTQ folks, they've blamed Jewish people, they've blamed Muslims, everybody except for themselves, when in reality, white males have created the power structure historically and created so many of these problems that we're experiencing today and that people of color are experiencing today. It is possible, I think, to deprogram somebody or to disengage them, because I've helped a lot of people do that. But it's very difficult and it takes a long time. And the process of disengagement is so much longer and more intensive than the process of radicalization. That happens really pretty quickly in a lot of cases. And America and our world, frankly, is just not set up to deal with de-radicalization or disengagement in any other way than it being political. And what I've tried to tell people for years is this is not a political discussion that you have with people when you disengage them. It is a discussion and a focus on their life and on the problems that they've experienced in their lives. People who become white supremacists own that. They do that because they want to, but before they find that ideology, there's a certain process that leads them to the fringes where there are people that are looking to scoop them up, and they do a really good job.
I mean, I don't even know how to respond to that. I think, he mentions people are looking for something. Join the chess club. I mean, it's not that simple. What I'm saying is he mentions, the process of becoming radical doesn't take long.
Doesn't take long.
And the process to pull people back is a long time, like he says, or near impossible.
What happened to his organization as it was gaining momentum?
2016 and 15, right before the administration changed from Obama to Trump, we had won, Life After Hate had won a grant, a $400,000 grant to kind of beef up our program. We had proven the concept and we were working with dozens of individuals at the time. And we wanted to expand. We wanted to offer more services for people because we saw this as a problem that was really on the horizon back then. We won a grant under the Obama administration. Then in January, the administration changed to the Trump administration. And immediately our funding was rescinded without really any explanation other than they didn't think at the time that white supremacy was as much of a problem as what they were really focused on back then, which was jihadist extremism. So they pulled our grant, and it affected us deeply. We weren't able to scale. We weren't able to grow at a time that was really important. And obviously, from 2016 to now, we're seeing how that white supremacist movement has really ramped up and done the things that I told you that they were going to do. Back in the 90s, there was a lot of pressure on white supremacists. And what you mentioned about kicking them out of your shows and things like that, that was one of the things that forced leaders at the time to realize that they needed to blend in, that they needed to not stand out. They stopped getting tattoos and swastika tattoos. Skinheads fell out of fashion. And they started to really morph into things like the military, law enforcement. They started to get jobs in the regular world, and they started to run for office. And they got rid of all of the things that made them noticeable. They stopped using language that really pinpointed who they were and what they believed in, and they started to make that language more palatable. And I think what we're seeing now today with politicians like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar and some of these folks who are very in line with the same white supremacist ideology that I was a part of in the 80s and 90s, they're repeating the same things. They're saying the same things. So I think these days, they're not as afraid to say those things, although they still don't look like we used to in the 80s and 90s. It's become mainstream. And I think that they've captured a large segment of American voters with this kind of fear rhetoric, with these conspiracy theories. We've seen QAnon flourish. We've seen white nationalism flourish because these ideas have been made to sound more palatable. And that was a concerted effort by white supremacist leaders in the 80s and 90s as they saw their effectiveness slipping. So here we are today electing people into office who are saying the same things 18-year-old neo-Nazi Christian Picciolini was saying almost verbatim. And it's sickening and it's really scary for somebody like me who for the last 20 plus years has been warning against this and been talking about what is to come if we don't pay attention. And we're still really not paying attention. We're still living in a society where some people think that white supremacy is just not a thing, that racial violence coming from whites or systemic racism is just not a thing. And of course, we know that that's not the truth.
He was so spot on. Like, we sat over beers in 1997, and he would tell me, this is happening. Me, I was all like, if we see neo-Nazis, we'd throw them out. Like, literally one time in California, one day, a daylight show, they were beating up people there. I said, it's time to take our shows back. Grab them and throw them over the barricade. And they literally, 10,000 people grabbed 30 neo-Nazis and threw them over the barricade. And they came over with all their tattoos and everything, and then they were screaming like, we're innocent, we're innocent. I said, you dress like a chicken, sometimes you get plucked like one. I believe that the younger generation, the people I work with day to day in schools and colleges, are becoming more skeptical of some of this stuff. We, as a generation, thought police were all good. We, as a generation, thought military was all good. We thought that all these people were here to serve and protect. And I believe the majority of them are. But there has been forces that have infiltrated some of these organizations that we need to start recognizing.
To be able to accuse organizations like the military or the police of having a major problem with that, I don't think there's a major problem. I think there's little...
No, the military doesn't know there's a problem. If someone capitalized on the system to infiltrate and create a problem, then it's a problem.
Right.
If people are going around using that guise of something that we all look as here to protect us, and then taking advantage of a population, then it is a problem we need to recognize.
Is more savvy. They're a lot more skeptical of the loud voices in the room. They're a lot more tuned into the differences that we all have and embracing those differences. They've been exposed to decades of us making the mistakes that they should avoid. Hopefully they're paying attention. I think some of them are. As people like us, we've been raised in a different news environment. I remember the days where you would tune into the broadcast news on Channel 2, NBC, ABC, and CBS. And those were your news channels, or you got it from a local newspaper. Those types of things really don't exist to influence people anymore. Everything's on the internet these days. And I think we just assumed growing up that we can trust our news sources, that we can also trust things on the internet. And I think young people are more skeptical of the things that they can trust. That's not to say young people aren't getting also sucked in to these problems, because I do deal with a lot of young people who, because of the internet, because there's so much information and it's hard to distinguish what's real and what's not, some of them are falling into this too. But yeah, I think more than not, young people are more savvy. They see through this and they're more willing to accept our differences and not even think about the differences. If somebody's gay or brown or black, they all just see themselves coming up in this environment where people like us are trying to control what they can think. And I think that they're rebelling against that.
I think what he's saying is true, that the younger generation is more skeptical. But this idea of there's not that much racism anymore, that we're evolving to a space where, the younger generation is more accepting and inclusive. I think a lot of people like me would like to say bullshit. And that, racism is just as bad a problem now as it was back in the day.
Maybe they feel empowered now. Maybe they feel empowered by the way we talk to each other.
I think the next generation, the kids below us, are smarter than we are. They're faster and quicker and all that. But I don't think they've got a much better handle on it than we did. I think it's just as bad as it used to be.
I asked Christian, does social media have any responsibility to where we've gotten as a society?
Well, if Elon Musk buys Twitter, then he's going to fix everything, I would imagine.
I think if he buys Twitter, we're fucked. If we allow people to buy a voice, if they can buy a voice in society, we're fucked. And I hope everyone turns off Twitter after that. Elon Musk should, and I hate the term, stay in your fucking lane.
Well, he's got a lot of lanes.
But here's your thing, Elon Musk, stay out of this. Everyone needs to stay out of it.
And what specifically do you mean?
Should we allow people to fucking spread misinformation?
I don't think so, but then that's the line that everybody's saying is freedom of speech, right?
Yeah, but misinformation is what's gotten us here right now.
Companies like Twitter and Facebook and Google and YouTube and TikTok all have a responsibility, just like you had a responsibility running the Warped Tour. If things happened in your fenced area, you were responsible for that, even if you didn't do it. If one of your bands acted a certain way or did something, there are consequences to that. And I think that these companies, first of all, they're huge, right? Millions and millions of people are on these platforms. The money that they make equals and rivals the GDP of most nations. But so much of the radicalization and so much of the kind of marginalization that is happening from these extremist groups is happening in social media spaces. And while, they get kicked off from time to time and things happen, they keep coming back. And I think these companies have a larger responsibility to understand the impact of what happens in their countries, in their worlds, and on their platforms. They don't offer services like most communities do, right? They don't offer mental health care. They don't offer access to law enforcement if something was to go wrong. In fact, they often put up barriers to those kinds of things because they say, listen, what happens on our platform is not our responsibility. It's the people's responsibility. But like in my community, if something was wrong, if I feel sick or if I'm having a crisis, I can go somewhere. I can find somebody to get help. But you can't really do that necessarily through these communities. So I think that they have to do a better job of understanding the power that they have, a better job of understanding what happens on their platforms and how it affects real people. Because I think oftentimes they see people as just digital certificates. And these are real people on the other end of this, the way we interact with each other. And I think that they have fostered an environment that's more about making money than it is about taking care of each other. And I would love to see some changes.
Make no mistake, of course it's about making money.
I'm going to ask you a question, though. Do you believe in free speech?
I do.
Does free speech protect false speech?
Well, look, you can equivocate false speech being the same as shouting fire in a crowded theater. So do I believe it's cool to shout fire in a crowded theater? Is that free speech? Fuck no, that's not. And I think you could equivocate some of the social media posts that are false information at that. But I think it's naive for him to think that any of these social media platforms aren't there to make money.
Here's my thing. If Mark Zuckerberg said we are going to slow down information for a second, we don't need to put things out immediately, and just fact check. We used to fact check. We used to have fact checking in media, journalism, television. You would do some fact checking before you put it out to the public. Do you believe we need to slow down information a little bit?
Well, I think you alluded to what I think is the problem. You said if Mark Zuckerberg slowed down information, like if Elon Musk buys Twitter and he has the ultimate say, this one person that has this ultimate power over social, I think that's the bigger problem. I think that I do see in my social media feed when anybody ever says something about COVID, there's a warning that immediately comes up that says, see the facts. Don't you see that in your feeds? I mean, what else are you going to ask them to do?
I'm at this point, we need to slow down information. Just for a second. Just slow it down for a second. We don't have to be the first on the point.
I think that idea is interesting. I don't think it will ever happen.
I asked him about, what do you think about the politicians today?
It's also really difficult to get anything done when we're going at each other because of these hot button issues. Politicians, it's job security for them to be there always talking about these issues. If they constantly got stuff done, maybe we would realize we don't need them as much as we think we do. Even with the fact that they're pushing all this garbage about pushing critical race theory in schools and can't say gay in places like, Florida, what they're essentially trying to do is dumb down the reasons that we have to question. As Americans, we've always been taught to question things and make sure you're finding the truth. How can we really do that if we're not getting all the information? And I really worry that for future generations, if these things keep continuing, I'm not talking about, adolescents now, but for future generations, they won't get an accurate picture of our history. They'll get this whitewashed picture of our history where we've always been perfect. We've always won everything. We've always done everything the right way, which is certainly not the case. The reason we are better now is because we've made mistakes and we've acknowledged those mistakes and we've strived to do better. But if we continue in the future with always thinking that we've never done anything wrong, or that slavery wasn't a real thing, or that we shouldn't talk about inequity in the world today, then I think we're going to skip over a generation and raise a generation that is intolerant, that isn't tuned into the truth. And I think that all these things are really creating this factory of racism to exist.
He's right. Back in the day when we saw, the news in the 80s and 90s, we just assumed that they were telling us the truth. And even then, they probably weren't. But now it's so blatantly clear that there's a left and there's a right bias. It's insane.
Everyone believes their pocket. Here's what I'm going to say, Tony, and I'm going to just say it because it goes back 20 years ago. And I didn't know you 20 years ago. I said I was worried about our public education system as they were cutting budgets and they were cutting school programs. Not in California being one of the last, but we're talking about all through America. And I traveled around the country, and I would say, we've gotten to a country that can have an opinion on three things. You can have a strong opinion on three things because it doesn't take a lot of knowledge to understand the world, economics, all these things. What are those three things I felt that people could have an opinion on? Guns, gays, and abortion.
Oh, God.
Okay?
Has that changed?
No. So here's where we're at in society. If you look at it, 20 years later.
Yeah, but those are politician buzz
No. They're church buzz. The church tells you that you can have an opinion on three things. So driving, have you ever driven through Alabama?
Oh, I know.
No, everyone has an opinion on three things. Guns, gays, and abortions. Three of the most, to be honest, personal choices in the world we've made into everyone has an opinion because it's easy to draw that opinion. So right now we're seeing more laws passed about guns, gays, laws passed against gay people, and abortion laws passed in America's society in the last 100 years. That's where we've gotten. We're passing laws there based on people's emotional response to them. So we are in a very trying time in American society if we've narrowed it down to those things. I'm just saying that we've now gotten to this point where we're fucking taking everyone's, making those the most important things in society. And that's what bums me out because we have taken it to those things in life. When those things were sorted out many, many years ago, we gave people with alternative lifestyles a choice. We gave women a choice. But here's the deal, Tony. I even fucked up once, all right? Because I think I have a pretty good read on people. And I try to give every person a right to come in and be part of my society. And one time, I let this guy come in. I asked Christian, does the name Baked Alaska ring a bell?
He became one of the most prolific, well-known alt-right trolls, somebody who was involved in the Charlottesville rally. He was at the Capitol on January 6th, live streaming. This is a guy who has been involved for many years in some of the worst things of the alt-right movement and in promoting that. And I know that was way before he was your assistant. He wasn't doing that kind of stuff then, but who would have known that he could have gone on to something like that? And I imagine there were probably a lot of potholes even before you'd met him that had accumulated over time. And once he didn't have an outlet, he found one, right? Once he didn't have more positive outlets, he found one that existed that ended up being negative. Baked Alaska or Tim Giannette is one of the most influential, at least in the last 5 or 6 years, alt-right people out there. He's not somebody that I've had, very much interaction with. He's certainly somebody I know. But yeah, oftentimes it happens, and it happens with family members. They just change on an instant, and you don't see it coming. Maybe that's a symptom of us not really delving into each other's personal business enough. Like, we need to ask questions when we see certain signs, or we need to have conversations with people once they raise red flags. And if they didn't exist then, maybe after he left the Warped Tour, he started to do that. And people around him at that time should have known to intervene.
I've known you a long time. I've never heard about this.
So this is the moment in time where you asked me, like, what the fuck, Kevin? And you just did.
Right.
I had a ton of interns that would come through the office every 6 months. We'd have 2 or 3 of them coming by. And all of a sudden, this kid starts showing up. And he was just kind of a nondescript kid, and he was a nice kid. And I go, I can't remember your name. What's your name? And he goes, Tim, I can't remember that. Like, where are you from? He goes, Alaska. So I go, I'm going to just call you Alaska. And then the kid would show up stoned all the time, like he's smoking weed. Not as stoned as Xavier is usually, but, it was like semi-stoned. I see him over there with his, like, seriously stoned. So one day I go, dude, I'm just going to call you Baked Alaska.
And he kept it as
his moniker. Like, so he left, went off on his own, whatever. He started becoming a rapper, I heard. So he actually was a rapper in Alaska. So when we did Warped Tour in Alaska, I let him play one time.
A rapper in Alaska.
Yeah, so he's up there. And then all of a sudden, I get an email like about 2 years ago. Like someone, I think Paul, emailed me and he goes, Kevin, dude, did you hear? This is Tim. He's now known as Baked Alaska in the white supremacist movement. So I always say there's one bad apple. Like, do I interview him? But I think he's in jail.
Yeah, how about no?
And that's the craziest thing, because we want to, like, yell at him and scream at him to get out of a movement, but it almost it's almost the wrong way to do. You have to understand, and I love that he told me about potholes. These people have hit potholes in their lives.
Looking for somebody to blame or something.
I think the right way to address it is, I understand you hit some potholes in life, and I want to understand with you. If you ever want to have a discussion about different things, I'm there. And they usually turn on me right away and go, you're totally buying into this fucking thing and potholes. Fuck that. I'm great. That's the crazy thing, Tony. I still believe, and this is what's going on, this crazy thing, all the stuff in the world, that if 97% of us were put in a room and told us to hang out like this, have an iced tea, a weird tea, or whatever we're drinking today,
It'd be fine.
We'd be fine. We'd figure it out. That's what I always appreciated about being on the road with everyone I knew on Warped Tour or any of the other tours I did. If we sat down and talked things over, we could find a common ground.
Well, there's something to be said for social media too, in the fact that there's nobody in the room. There's no ramifications of your statements. There's some things that are easier for you to say in your pajamas and alone in your room as you're typing than us all collectively sitting at and hanging out. So I don't know what your opinion is about that, but I think social media allows that behavior to flourish.
One of the great things about Christian, he's actually been able to write books and get them published into like places like Amazon and places like that. We talk on our podcast instead of writing a book. So I just asked, if you wanted to learn certain segments of his life, which book would you read?
I would say the one that would keep people more into my life and what I experienced personally is my memoir, and that's White American Youth. If they want to learn about the work that I do now, if they want to learn about disengagement or some of the red flags to look for, if there's somebody maybe in their family that might be in the extremist world, then they should read Breaking Hate, which is my newest book. And that kind of goes through the stories of people that I've worked with.
If you wanted to get involved in this movement or think that someone's maybe that has been kind of involved in this movement and maybe you want to know how to address it, how would you find out more information?
Pretty easy to find. ChristianPicciolini.com is my website. I'm on social media. If you just Google ex-neo-Nazi skinhead and Christian, my first name, that'll come up. But I just want to say thanks, Kevin. You really were a big inspiration on me. The years 95 and 96. 96 was the first year that I went to Warped Tour. It was actually the year that my non-political band, my punk band, Random 55, played a battle of the bands. I think it was the Ernie Ball stage. And I don't think we actually got to play Warped Tour. I think we came in second place. But it was the first year that I went to Warped Tour. And it was the year that I was transitioning out of that movement. And it was the exposure to bands that you promoted, bands that you put in one place, and the people that really helped change me. So I don't want to underestimate the impact that you had on my life change. So thank you for that.
That's cool, Kevin.
Yeah.
The fact that he credits that experience for pulling him out of the movement, the Warped Tour experience, is
I mean, that's,
just that one thing.
For me, it's almost inspired me to start it up again, Tony.
You keep hinting at this shit, and now you're in the bands again? What's going on, Kevin? Who have you been listening to these past couple of weeks? Is that right?
Oh, one band, The Who.
No, that's it, because we already said that on the last episode.
It's okay. All I've been listening to is The Who. They go all the time, because you should see me and Fran. It's like picture the Wizard of Oz, okay? Oh, picture the Wizard of Oz and the Munchkins. And
the
they
Seven
play
Dwarfs.
The Who. No, The Who and the Seven Dwarfs. That's me and Fran in the kitchen right now. Totally wacky, but that's what we do. As soon as they come on, we get into this whole fucking march step thing going.
Jesus, and we got to put a picture of him at Coachella in the front row on this episode looking at The Who. Look, thank you to everyone for listening. Make sure you subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, and leave us a review.
And you know what? I just do want to say, people, we've lost a few people like Gilbert Gottfried this past couple of weeks.
Right?
I mean,
I didn't know he was on Saturday Night Live.
Yeah,
Did you know that?
pretty gnarly. We lose people a lot, and unfortunately, we have to keep moving forward. And we've lost so many people over, and it's crazy right now. But we have this fun doing this podcast, Tony, and it's always great to hang out here. And we're going to go sit and barbecue right now and have a nice time, because that's all we can do at the moment. Enjoy your friends.
Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook to see the weekly cooking and gardening tips from Mr. Kevin Lyman.
And tell my kids to do their homework.
And if you want more of my Warp Life content, subscribe to Patreon. A subscription is only $5, and you can stop anytime. It all goes to charity. Hey, Diego, take it away! Do your homework.